Donald Trump called him tough. Rush Limbaugh read one of his articles live on his radio show. Ann Coulter tweeted that article to her 1.5 million followers and declared, "Every sentence is perfect." Ladies and gentlemen, your host, former chief editor of the Jewish Press, Elliot Resnick.
Welcome to the Elliot Resnick Show, where we interview fighters and firebrands on the political and cultural battlefields. With us today is Rabbi Daniel Lapin, who is a TV host, a podcast host, a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, and president of the American Alliance of Jews and Christians. On top of all of that, he also has the zchus of being the great-nephew of Reb Elyah Lopian. Welcome, Rabbi Lapin, to the program.
Thank you very much, Elliot. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk with you.
Thank you kindly. Before we discuss your work, I'd like to ask you a bit about your background, if that's okay. So, 2 questions. Your great uncle, as I said, was Reb Elyah Lopian. Did you know him? And number 2, you currently live in Baltimore, I believe, but you grew up in South Africa. How did a branch of the Lopian family wind up in South Africa?
I knew him very well. For a number of years, I was his talmid. I also helped take care of him as a family member at the yeshiva in Kfar Hasidim. And so I certainly spent a great deal of time with him. And what happened was that one of Reb Elyah's brothers went to America and established the Chicago branch of the family. And another brother went to South Africa and established that branch. And that's how my father came to be born in South Africa, and so did I.
And they were all originally from Lithuania?
Yeah.
And your father changed the name to Lapin?
I don't know if it was the actual family member or a harried immigration official.
I see. Okay, and you say you spent time with your great uncle. How much time, and let's say if you have to pick, let's say 1 or 2 lessons that you were particularly impressed by being around him, what would you say that is, or those were?
Well, it was a few years, and my job was to help him. He was an older man, and I was, to help him fasten his shoes and do all those basic things, which was an honor. And turned out the very first day I was there, I got beset by a stomach infection, which was quite common for people arriving unaccustomed to Israeli water back then. This was in the 60s. And instead of me attending to him, he brought in breakfast for me early in the morning, which was painful. He was an old man. It took him a long time to cross the room with a tray of my breakfast, and I was confined to bed. I felt absolutely awful. I've never forgotten the dreadful feeling. But that was very typical. He was very much concerned, first of all, for people's well-being, and then for their soul and their spirit after that.
You host a TV show called Ancient Jewish Wisdom, whose audience is primarily Christian.
About 90% of the audience is Christian, yes.
Okay, so you presumably find meaning in this work, and I'd like to ask you what that is. But first, I'd like to address the much more general topic of teaching Torah to non-Jews. We all know that there's some sort of prohibition against teaching Torah to non-Jews, but most of us have very little idea what exactly this prohibition includes. And I actually wonder about the entire prohibition, because Hashem gave the Torah to us, but he clearly wanted us to spread its values to the rest of the world. And that's inherent in the words, Mamlechas Kohanim and Or LaGoyim. A kingdom of priests, by definition, is required to minister to people. And in Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations, means you have to spread light to other people. So how do you understand the entire prohibition? How can we spread Torah ideas in the world if we're not supposed to teach Torah to non-Jews?
Well, without delving into a halachic discussion, which nobody wants to do, we'll say that at one end, Kuli Alma Lo Pligi, that Kabbalah matters cannot be shared. And on the other end, everybody agrees that Tanakh can be. And where exactly the line is placed, somewhere between Tanakh and Kabbalah, everybody decides. In my case, I was helped in that decision by Rabbi Avigdor Miller and by Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. And it was determined what is appropriate for me in the work I was doing. And I'm not going to publicize it further because it's not relevant to anybody else.
Right, okay. I think I've heard that dichotomy between Torah Shebaal Peh and Torah Shebiksav, but so many of the Torah Shebiksav matters that we learn about in yeshiva, we learn about through the prism of Torah Shebaal Peh. Meaning, if you're talking about honoring one's parents, well, there's that verse in the Torah, but all the details and how we really understand what that really includes.
No, I don't think it excludes matters of Torah Shabbat. I think specifically Kabbalah things.
Okay, so now let me ask you about the question about the value you find in it.
Oh, I mean, to me, it was obvious a long time ago that former President Jimmy Carter was a Baptist preacher, a lay Baptist preacher, and yet was somebody who was a Sonei Yisrael and just an unpleasant piece of work. And it was hard for me to understand, what distinguished him from, shall we say, Pat Robertson, who is a huge lover of Israel and very philo-Semitic. And eventually I discovered the answer is very simple, and that is whether or not you believe in Torah Sinai. And in that sense, I realized was exactly what distinguishes Jews as well. Many, if not most Jews, will say they believe in God. But if it comes to the question of whether homosexuality is a sin or not, there are huge differences in the way Jews take it. So the question is whether you believe that God gave his message to mankind through Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai or not. And Jew and Christian that believe yes, love Jews, love Israel, and Jews and Christians who don't are problematic. And it was as simple as that. So I realized that if I wanted to make sure that America would continue to be a hospitable place for Jews, then anything I could do to reaffirm and strengthen Christians' commitment to the Torah as being God's message for mankind, I'd be doing something good for my children and my grandchildren and yours.
Carter, you're saying, does not believe that the Torah was given to Moshe at Har Sinai?
He would answer in exactly the same way that many Reform rabbis would. He'd start the answer with the word, well, it depends. That's what he would say.
I see. Interesting. And do you also see yourself as sort of part of the larger value that I mentioned before of being, I guess, like a Mamlechas Kohanim, spreading God's ideas to the general population?
That's a little bit too general and grandiose for me. I paint on a smaller canvas.
I see. Okay. I'm wondering what's your view of Christianity in general. From a very broad historical view, I think Christianity was a wonderful development. Before Christianity, most of the civilized world was pagan. Today, most of it is monotheistic. Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch essentially writes as much in one of his essays. But most from Jews today are suspicious of Christianity. I think thanks to 1,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. How do you view Christianity?
Well, I'm not a theologian. I am a Torah student. And the difference is that a Torah student is interested in knowing what God says about people. Theologians are interested in what people say about God. I couldn't be less interested in that. So I don't know anything about Christianity, but I share your view that if God hadn't wanted it to arise in the world, it wouldn't have. And it's become the greatest tool for spreading monotheism that the world has ever known. I also think it's very important. I don't use the word frum. You said frum Jews think differently about. I don't use the word frum because I don't know anywhere in the whole Torah where it says, and thou shalt be frum. I don't know what the word means. I think it's a socio-cultural word, not a halachic word. And so I dismiss the word entirely. I don't use it. I think there's a wide range of what people in the Orthodox Torah committed community feel. But at the very least, they owe it to themselves to figure out the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. They should know that all the halachic rulings and every comment that Rishonim made about Christians were made about Catholics, not about Protestants, because the Reformation hadn't happened yet. So if you're going to make pronouncements about non-Jews, the least you owe it to yourself and the people you speak to is know a little bit about the subject.
Interesting. And the difference would be Catholicism includes many more icons in their observance? Or?
No, the difference is vast. We can't go into it
Okay.
here, but essentially the main difference is Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Catholicism is not Bible study oriented. Protestantism is, and that's a huge difference. America was built by Protestants, not by Catholics, specifically in terms of the early founders. The particular form of Christianity that shaped America and that President Abraham Lincoln called Old Testament Christianity were Protestants.
I've been trying to share with people recently. I've discovered, thanks to one of Rabbi Adlerstein's articles, he mentions that both the Evan Ezra and Makedas Yitzchak, and I've discovered since then that Maharal writes the same exact thing, that Aseret HaDibros are written in decreasing order of severity. That the worst possible thing you could be is an atheist. So that's the first Dibra. So in the worst interpretations, in the worst halachic interpretations of Christianity, at the very worst, you would be violating the second Dibra, not the first Dibra. So, meaning a secular atheist today, the secular leftist would be worse
Well,
to
the,
be.
the evidence the evidence is that Jewish survival in America is threatened far more by atheism and secularism than it is by Christianity. If anything, Israel's safety belt is America's Bible belt.
Right. And I always say also, in terms of when raising kids or raising teenagers, when's the last time you had a teenager who converted to Christianity? And yet, how many hundreds or even thousands of teenagers go off and are attracted to secular hedonism, basically? If it feels good, do it.
No, I
Okay.
agree with you entirely.
You used to run an organization called Toward Tradition that was associated with the Republican Party in the 1990s. I think it was actually the first Jewish organization to publicly declare that Jews stand for Torah values, not liberal values. And when I say publicly, I mean that at least twice, I believe, you broadcasted this message in the New York Times, which was still a semi respectable paper back then. Whatever happened to this organization? Why did you let it fade away?
Didn't fade away. It morphed into the American Alliance of Jews and Christians. And so it's alive and well and thriving today, even as we speak. We changed it because it was too associated with the Republican Party, and we wanted to be associated with ultimate values, not with any particular party. And so, as I say, it turned into the American Alliance of Jews and Christians. Also, the name was misleading. Nobody could understand whether it was toward tradition or Torah tradition or towards tradition. It was just a badly chosen name, which I chose. And so the American Alliance of Jews and Christians worked better. And the American Alliance of Jews and Christians is in the process of morphing into the International Alliance of Jews and Christians, because the war on faith and secular socialism is today an international battle. And so the attempts to combat it have to be international also.
I wonder though. Also, maybe I'm completely wrong, but I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking maybe you had decided at a certain point that because let's say in this past elections we saw that the Republicans didn't win, and sometimes when you don't win, you realize what, maybe the real battle is not on the political front; it's more on the grassroots
Yeah.
educational front, because that's how you win long term. Is that part of your calculation of what you?
It's just some wit, I forget who it was, called the America's two parties, the evil party and the stupid party. And I'm afraid it's sometimes hard to argue with that. What Lindsey Graham was doing about trying to turn abortion into the whole conservative position is that it's not a federal issue, it's up to the states. So how stupid do you have to be to do what he did? I don't get it. Number two, you alluded to the fact that my organization years ago advertised in the New York Times. We had a full page ad in 1994. Newt Gingrich, in the midterm election of the Clinton presidency, it was 1994. Clinton had been up for 2 years. He had been just as radical and as crazy as Biden has been. And Newt Gingrich came up with this great idea of a 10-point contract with America. And it caused the greatest red sweep. Since then, there's never been anything like it, what happened in the 94 elections. Right now, all the Republican Party needed to do was say to America, hey, here are the 10 things we will do as soon as you give us Congress. We'll stop men walking into little girls' bathrooms. We'll stop transgender mutilation. We'll stop men intruding into women's sports. A list of 10 things that almost every sane American would be in favor of. That's all they had to do. And I don't doubt this would have been a huge red sweep, just as Newt Gingrich pulled off in 94. At the time, we ran a New York Times ad saying, Mazel Tov, Speaker Gingrich, we Jews know all about 10-point contracts. And we signed it with about 200 names of Jewish conservatives. I guess you weren't there yet. But I was wondering if your name was on it, but it wouldn't have been. But anyway, that's what needed to happen now. So we're happy to be less of a political, and as you say, politics is downstream of culture, as the wise have always said. And we prefer to operate in the culture and know that as we little by little change hearts, that will change the politics in due course.
I met you at a CPAC Shabbaton 2 or 3 years ago, and you mentioned to me that there's no Hebrew word for teenager, which is interesting. What's the significance of that?
Well, the significance is that Hebrew Lashon HaKodesh has all the words that you need to have, and words that aren't there shouldn't be there. And so adolescent, for example, an adolescent is somebody who wants all the benefits of being an adult with none of the responsibilities. It doesn't exist. So in the Lapin household, children could decide. You can be an adult or you can be a child, whatever you like. It's your choice. And we'll be consistent. But we don't you can't ever say, but I'm a teenager, or hey, I'm an adolescent. We're not interested in that. You're a child or you're an adult in exactly the same way as you're a boy or you're a girl. In that case, there's no decision about it, but you can decide to be an adult or be a child, and we'll treat you accordingly. So that's many words like that. You've heard politicians constantly say things like the rich must pay their fair share. Know anywhere in the Torah where it
Yes.
says v'hiyitem fair?
Right. It's,
Right? There is no such word for fair. That's so much so that even when little kids in Israel want to say the phrase that kids are born knowing, hey, it's not fair, they have to say zeh lo fair, because there is no word in Hebrew, because the word fair is undefined and meaningless.
I guess people just think fair means so just or something like that. Lot tzedek or something.
Well, they're wrong.
In what sense? Is fair more subjective or?
Well, because just has a set of definitions. If you speak of justice, you have to say according to what justice? According to, the laws of Moses in Israel, or according to the laws of the United Kingdom, or according to the laws of the Federal Republic of Germany.
Right. So justice has certain rules associated with it.
If you use the word justice or morality, you have to have an addendum, namely according to what
Whereas the
framework.
word fair you don't, in other words.
Fair means absolutely nothing. Or does it mean equal? Then say equal.
Right. I was listening to one of your podcasts in preparation for doing this interview, and you had a sentence in there which I found intriguing. You said, quote, in many cases, psychology is precisely the illness which it claims to cure. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
This is very controversial. And as you know, I hate being controversial. My paths are the paths of righteousness, and my ways are the ways of peace. But yes, the growth of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Mental Health Profession, this has grown from a small booklet, DSM-1, to something the size of what used to be the Manhattan Telephone Directory in the old days when there were telephone directories. And this is, in actual real medicine, we do not find that. We do not find a growing list. Tuberculosis was a disease. We got rid of it, came back. Polio is a disease. But it's not as if the number of diseases just keeps on growing and growing and growing. In mental health, it does. That should be a clue. The second thing is follow the money, and that will give another indication. So I think doctors like Thomas Sass and many others who believe that the mental health industry has become an out of control industry, which is essentially a wealth transfer program in America, are onto something. I think they're probably right. And many things that the mental health industry believe can be cured with a pharmacological solution are things that probably need a spiritual solution more than anything else.
Just for people who don't know, Thomas Saz wrote the book, I believe, called The Myth of Mental Illness. I was just walking on the street.
Very good. How you always surprise me with the things you know.
Oh, thank you kindly. I discovered it. There's a book called Torah and Psychology, written by Rabbi Abraham Amsel 50 years ago. I discovered it completely by accident, bought it on Amazon, a used book for like $80. Now it's like $20 somehow, but I got it at 80, the only copy I could find. And
Well,
he
it was worth it. It was worth it then, and it's worth it now.
I agree, and I'm trying to maybe possibly get it republished because it's been out of print for a long time. And he quotes the myth of mental illness, so I bought it and started reading it. But also, I just was on the street the other day, and I was walking by in Manhattan. You know, these people who have these little carpets, and they're selling stuff on the carpets. This person had a title called "Plato, Not Prozac," and the subtitle was something like "Applying Eternal Wisdom to Modern Day Problems." And I thought that's exactly what we're saying. Most mental health problems are not health problems. They're problems of, like you said, religious problems, philosophical problems. You need wisdom. You don't need some therapist to give you a drug or massage your ego. You need wisdom, eternal wisdom.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying there's no organic diseases. There are. But overwhelmingly, many of the things that become mental illnesses are the result of Freudian idea that human beings are nothing other than $9 worth of common chemicals. And so all we need are psychotropic drugs to fix absolutely any mental problem. It's not true. Many of these things are spiritual diseases and can be cured spiritually without any medication at all.
Right. And I mean, Roy Amstel, it's an interesting book. He writes at one point that as far as he's concerned, most mental health problems are really problems of character. I mean, he says if you're anxious, that means something's wrong with your belief system. You shouldn't. A Jew should never really be extremely anxious. if he truly believes in Hashem the way he's supposed to.
Yeah. No, it is no, and also it's, community. A lot of mental illness is the result of loneliness. A marriage has fallen away. People are not having children, and so yes, I get it that a 45 or 50-year-old single woman, who's living on the Upper East Side and at the tail end of a career with no children and no husband. I get it that she needs to go to a therapist. I get that, and I know the therapist wants to bill for his time. So he'll plug in something from DSM-5, and she's now one of the ranks of the mentally ill. I get it.
Okay, I guess last question, and I know this is a big topic, and maybe just give like one or two pointers. I think the case for why an Orthodox and religious Jew should be a conservative on social issues, I think is very clear. Obviously, the Torah does not condone homosexuality or transgenderism, all these kind of things, or abortion on demand. What's the Torah case for on let's say economic or other issues? Why a Torah Jew should be a Republican?
Fascinating question, and obviously you and I should have a symposium on it for 4 hours. But it flows from a very basic question that we all have to ask ourselves, which is, what was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan for human economic interaction? And if you can't answer that, then you're in no position to rule on any din in Choshen Mishpat. You have to understand, you got to know why the Vilna Gaon said the study of economics is important. Many others did as well. And so there's a basic question, and that is whether making money is a good thing or a bad thing. Now, this gets seriously confused by cultural imperatives today in the Jewish world, wherein learning in Kollel has become a be-all and end-all in and of itself. And so something which was originally set in place in the aftermath of World War II as a temporary Horaz Shah, a temporary ruling in order to rebuild Torah scholarship, has become a way of life. And so when young girls go and talk to a shadchan, the first question the shadchan asks, and I speak this as the father of 6 daughters, I know what I'm talking about. The first question the shadchan asks is not, what is your family's outlook? How did you interact with your siblings? How your parents married? None of that. The only question is, will you support a husband in learning? That's number one question. Do you want to marry an earner or a learner? And this is a huge problem. This is not part of what the Borei Olam planned for human economic interaction. The marriage ketubah has the man making a kinyan as he undertakes to be mezin and mefarnes, to support financially and sustain his wife. This is exactly the opposite of what we're told today. We used to place a great emphasis on kavoda bas melech panima. The honor and prestige of a Jewish woman is internal, and today we send them out to work so their husbands can stay home when the kids are sick. It's an upside down perversion. And so it distorts anything that anyone wants to say. I'm aware even now as I'm speaking to you that I'm saying things that will label me as hostile to the frum world, as it were. But I'm not. I mean, God forbid. I am part of the Haredi world. I am a Haredi myself. I don't wear the Haredi uniform, but then I don't think the Haredi uniform is called for anywhere in the Torah. And so the real question is, what is the Torah approach to finance? And are people supposed to live on charity, or are people supposed to make money? And is making money a good thing or a bad thing? There's a lot of ambivalence about this, because the very same people who speak about the evils of Gashmius and the evils of chasing money do exactly that when they're on fundraising missions for their institution.
So you're arguing that the left is predicated on the welfare state and the right is not? Is that the underlying argument here?
I'm not saying that libertarian economics is from the Torah. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that a Torah financial system in today's climate, which is an epidemic of statism, would veer much more towards free market than not. The idea of a welfare industry doesn't exist in the Torah. Everyone has to give charity, but the idea that there's an entire class of people who make a living administering it, and that there are hundreds of thousands of social workers who'd starve to death if the welfare industry died, these are not Torah principles at all. and that the closer you are to Torah observance, the more poverty-stricken you are. That's not exactly the promises that are made in the Torah to those who shmartim. Those of you who keep these words will live in comfort. The Torah is very clear about that.
So just a quick follow-up. So, I mean, because people always mention, well, there's Peah and there's Maser, so that is some sort of welfare system in the Torah, but
Yeah, everybody is obliged to give charity to the recipient, not to an industrial complex that'll distribute it for you.
Okay.
And that way there's a relationship between the giver and the recipient.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you very, very much for your time.
A pleasure talking with you as always.
All right. That does it for us. If you want to learn more about Rabbi Lapin, just go to rabbilapin.com. There you're going to find links to his podcast, to his Facebook page, to his Twitter page, to his videos, to his articles, to his wife's articles, to his audiobooks, all sorts of goodies if you go to rabbilapin.com. And then he has another website called happywarriors.com. Next week, we will be interviewing Dan Watkins. I was supposed to be interviewing him this week, but he had to reschedule because he has a court case coming up. I think he told me he's going to be doing 30 depositions over the next 25 days. So he was forced to reschedule. We will be interviewing him for next week. He's a lawyer involved in medical malpractice cases. Specifically, right now, he's involved in cases involving remdesivir, which his clients claim killed their loved ones, and cases involving gender mutilation. Also, don't forget our new venture, which we will be launching, God willing, this coming week, called Get Educated Through Elliot. This is a new venture. I will be reading 52 books, 52 major books that all educated people should be familiar with. Books by Nietzsche, by Plato, by Dostoevsky, by Schopenhauer, by Shakespeare, Betty Friedan, one leftist book in the mix, her feminine mystique book, very famous. All books that educated people should know, and I will be reading them and summarizing their major their contents and their major arguments and discussing them from a right-wing point of view. By the time you finish listening to the recording, 1 hour per book, you will be acquainted with the book. You will be familiar with it. So if somebody mentions it in conversation, you will know all about it. So for conversation purposes, for your own knowledge, if you're ever curious, I wonder what, Nietzsche's philosophy of life was. I always wanted to read All Quiet on the Western Front. What is that about? What's Frederick Hayek's The Road to Serfdom? What's Kant's Critique of Pure Reason about? I will let you know. I will be reading it, and I will let you know. And you could educate yourself through me. That is the idea. And in addition to getting all these recordings, this is going to be for a fee. My regular podcast will always be free, but this particular one, Get Educated Through Elliot, and please forgive the self-reference, that one will be $10 a month or $100 for the year. And in addition to getting all these recordings on all these major books, you will also be getting free PDF copies of my research papers that I did en route to getting my PhD. Research papers on Meir Kahane and the Civil Rights Movement, on the morality of the Judenrat's actions during the Holocaust, on Mendele Meicher Sfarm's solution to the Jewish problem, on Zionism in the 19th century in America, on Marcus Lehman's novels, on Nietzsche's influence on Yisrael Eldad, who was one of the heads of Lehi. A lot of very interesting material, if I may say so myself. You don't have to agree with everything I wrote, but the topics themselves I personally found very interesting at the time. And when I started rereading them recently, I found them very interesting all over again. So stay tuned for all that. That new venture will be launching, God willing, next week. All right. Hope to see everyone next week. In the meantime, have a great night or a great day, depending when you're listening to this podcast.